Hi, this is Randy Rice, and I would like to welcome you to my podcast on the value of testing. And this is actually kind of a reboot of the podcast. Actually, I started out doing podcasting probably over 20 years ago, actually, and I don't know, for some reason, I just kind of stopped doing it. And I don't know if I got busy, got tired, or what. A lot of water under that bridge, you know. So anyway, I thought it might be interesting to try to resume the podcast and to put some things out there, all basically under the theme of the value of testing. And there's a lot of ways we can go here. You know, this is once again the first episode, and I sat down the other day and started jotting out ideas for other episodes, and I came up with quite a few in a hurry. So I hope this is something that you're going to find helpful. If it is, I hope that you share it with others, and of course, you know the whole deal of like, share, and subscribe basically helps me get visible out there and for some of this information to be dispersed. And I hope that this is kind of like me sitting across the table from you if we were doing some kind of consulting session or something like that. I do a lot of consulting, I do a lot of training, and I just love working with people and helping them solve some of the toughest software testing problems that they might have. So with that, I want to talk today about actually the name of the podcast, the value of testing, the value of software testing. And I thought that would be maybe the appropriate first topic here. Now, in other episodes, as I mentioned, we may be talking about things like, I think the next one I want to do is going to be on the value of strategies. And really, what is a strategy and why is it something you need? But today, let's talk about the value of testing because, as I see what a lot of companies are doing, it really kind of is discouraging in a way because we hear of a lot of job cuts in the field of testing, and it really concerns me. Of course, AI is being a big disruptor and basically a sea change in how we do testing. But I thought it would be important to come back to this one central idea of what is it that makes what we do valuable as testers. And I want to just kind of put it out there that when you do anything in life that is something that you're going to be doing a test of, there's an importance attached to that, like a blood test or maybe testing the tire pressure on your vehicles, so that you don't have a flat by the side of the road or something like that, or, a tire is getting low. There's so many things that involve testing, even when you're cooking and you want to see how something is going on the stove or something, and you take a quick taste test of that. Testing is it's literally embedded in everything we do as humans. And software development is no different. We do a lot of things in software development that need to be tested. It's funny, maybe you've had this experience too when someone asks what you do for a living and you say, well, I test software, and you try to explain what that means. In fact, this just happened to me. Last week I was getting a haircut, and the young lady cutting my hair, she asked what it was that I did. And it's funny because she had just finished kind of complaining to me that they had put a new system in where she worked, and that the system wasn't printing out the notes correctly for people getting haircuts. And so I told her, I said, well, that's kind of funny because that's one of the things that I do is I teach companies how to avoid those kind of problems so that they don't wind up frustrating people like you. And her response was, wow, that must be a very badly needed service. And I said, yes, it is. However, not all the people that really need it appreciate that. So, the thing about it is when we're talking about testing, it's really important to understand value. And value is what's attached to something by someone that wants to see a benefit from something. There's the other kind of corollary to this of the cost of testing, which is a totally different thing that we need to look at too. But where do we actually find the value points in testing? And it's really important for you as a tester to understand this, but it's also really important that you're able to communicate that to your stakeholders. And your stakeholders may be way far up in the food chain where you work, so it may not be an easy thing to kind of reach out and communicate, but we'll talk about maybe some ways that you can do that. The flip side of that coin is if you don't communicate the value of testing, that's when the risks start to appear of senior management saying, well, what is it that testing does anyway? Why can we just replace all those testers with AI or with test automation or something like that? And if they don't really understand all the things that go into testing, then once again, that's where the risk appears of job cuts and things like that. So I always tell testers, you really have to understand your value. Now, this is not a new thing for me. I've been talking about this in conferences and classes. If you've been a part of any of those over the last 20 or more years, you'll hear me talk about how important it is that we are more than just bug finders. I'll talk about that here in just a minute, about the tension there that exists in testers about finding bugs and then doing all the other stuff that testers do. But the other thing about it is, if you don't communicate your value in testing, there's, I would say, a low likelihood that anyone else is going to communicate that. Now, of course, you may have raving fans in your company about what you do, and that's great. The more of those you have, the better. For example, the developer that tells someone about what a great thing it was that you found this defect when you found it, otherwise it would have gone out to customers. Having someone else tell that story is a very powerful thing. It's almost like a testimonial. In fact, it is a testimonial, really. So when we look at the purpose of testing, that is one of the big drivers of the value of testing. It all goes back to what you're trying to do in testing. For example, are you trying to find defects, or are you trying to prove correctness, or maybe do some other things, meet regulatory requirements, or meet stakeholder requirements, or something like that? So you have to really kind of identify what your overall goals and objectives of testing are to know where you find the value in those things. If your goal in testing is just simply to prove that something works, then that's an easy bar to meet a lot of times. You're typically going down the happy path of things, and you're just showing where something works. But, if you don't try to find where it doesn't work, you're missing an important piece of the puzzle there. Now, there are many ways that we can see the ramifications or the cost of defects. And that's one of the ways that you can show the value of testing, is to show what defects actually are costing your organization. Now, just a few that you might think of here. One would be the lost time it takes in fixing defects. If you have a very high defect level, then your developers are probably spending a lot of time fixing defects, and you're probably spending a lot of time retesting those fixes, and then doing other kind of things like regression testing and stuff like that. There's also a cost associated with what's known as context switching, where you're doing one thing right now, then all of a sudden you get interrupted, and now you have to do something else like fix a defect. If you start doing a lot of that stuff, you enter into a mode that I call thrashing. And you're just simply going back and forth, and there is a cost because your mind has to reset after it's doing those things. And if you do a lot of context switching, then you're going to find yourself before long just getting super fatigued at just dealing with all the interruptions. There's also something that I've noticed in organizations that have high defect levels, and that is the people that work there are typically dissatisfied and they have lower morale. Now, in this job market, they may not leave. These people may stick around and continue to do their work. I think some people have called it quietly quitting, but the mood there isn't good, and people are just not proud of the work that they're doing. And that shows itself in so many other ways than the product that's being delivered. The other thing, too, that you'll typically see is customer dissatisfaction. And a lot of companies, even though they may have people out there to deal with customer dissatisfaction, a lot of times I don't think they really truly factor it into the decisions that they make. And they say that they want to satisfy the customer, but really when it boils down to it, what they really mean is we want to get the release out on time. And if the product is bad, if there's defects in it, we'll fix it later. By the way, that whole attitude of fixing it later in production is kind of frustrating because in the 1990s, in fact, maybe late 80s, it started, there was a big push, a global push towards quality. And the Japanese were making huge strides in quality improvement. And the U.S. soon followed because we were competing with Japanese products. And you would hear people actually say things like, let's get it right the first time. And even though, yes, we make mistakes and we have defects, this is where the whole thing of Six Sigma came to be, and total quality management and all the things that were really big in the 90s. Then the internet came along. And once the internet came along, then the cycles became much, much faster to deliver products. And we started working in what's known as internet time. And then the focus shifted totally away from trying to get it right the first time to we'll make it better later. And that was one of the biggest shifts, I think, in when you started to see the quality of software really go downhill. I mean, I could blame it on other things too. I mean, when Agile came along, people started doing less and less in the name of Agile, even though Agile wasn't really to blame for that. It was people's misapplication of Agile. There was a lot of things that happened. But anyway, I digress. One other thing, too, that happens is a loss of reputation in your company. One of the things that really I think companies have as a value point is their reputation. And there have been companies that have lost significant customer market share because of poor software quality. Now, there's also some other kind of things like legal and compliance ramifications. One of the biggest ones I can think of as an example on that was the NASDAQ outage back during the Facebook IPO that I think happened in like 2012, I believe. And to date, that one incident, when Facebook, when the IPO went live, it crashed on performance. The total cost, I think, to this point has been at least over $60 million for those 3 lines of code that got into a loop, basically. And it's kind of funny because one of the things that happened at that point was the Securities and Exchange Commission got involved. And I mean, you can read about this. You can just simply Google it and find it on the web. But they had a list of recommendations. And one of the recommendations was that NASDAQ start a QA department. And I thought that was kind of funny because I had been at NASDAQ and the exchanges before that had happened doing some consulting. And not long after my work there ended, they got rid of the entire department. And so then you see something like this happen. Now, I'm telling you, $60 million plus is a lot of money. A lot of that was fines and restitutions and lawsuits and things like that, basically. one thing to factor into this is something called the 110-100 rule, which basically says that if it takes me, let's say, 1 hour to fix a defect in requirements, it might take 10 hours to fix it in testing, and 100 times or more to test it in production. And that can even go higher than 100, by the way. I call that kind of the ripple effect of what we see with defects. So obviously, the sooner you find a defect, the better. That's what's behind the whole shift left idea, which obviously, it became a term in the forefront fairly recently, but it was popular and needed way before it became the buzzword that it did become. And one other thing to consider here when it comes to the cost of defects, and I'm going to give you some numbers here in just a moment, but when you think about security vulnerabilities, many times those are basically software defects that can be exploited for the purpose of gaining access to something or causing something to behave in ways that are different than what was designed. So therefore, then an attacker can manipulate things and can gain access and maybe get privileges they shouldn't. So it's those cybersecurity vulnerabilities that lead to those security defects that can cost over $1 million or more per incident, mainly because, once again, you get legal involved at that point, and you're paying people, you're paying fines, and you're paying for credit monitoring and all kinds of things that can be a result of that. Now, just as kind of a benchmark here, there's an organization called the CISQ that they put out a 2022 report that they estimated that the cost of poor software quality just in the U.S. alone has grown to at least $2.41 trillion. And that's a staggering amount of money. And you just think about all the companies that are contributing into that. And, each company could have a pretty big share, actually, when it comes right down to it. And there are some estimates that I've seen that the research is showing that the average cost per production defect is around $16,000. And cybersecurity defects, once again, can exceed over $1 million. And these are numbers that have been obtained through various research projects and metrics. But I always give caution there, because I don't think there's such a thing as industry averages, because we don't measure enough stuff well enough to give those. But suffice it to say that the number is big. And when you multiply it by a lot of defects, then you start to see, wow, we need something. We need some way to try to prevent these defects from escaping into production. Now, one thing that I will also mention here about the value of testing is that a way to think about testing is, as you might think of, as a filter or series of filters. I sometimes use the coffee pot analogy where, let's say you want to make a cup of coffee and you have a filter there, and let's say you're doing a pour over or something, and you start to make the coffee, and once you make the coffee, you realize that, I have grounds in it, and it's an unpleasant experience. As an avid coffee drinker, I just cannot stand grounds in my coffee. But you have to ask the question, well, what happened? Did the filter fail? Did something pour over the edge or something? What happened here? Well, sometimes these filters do fail. And in the world of software, the filters that we typically see are things like unit testing and system testing and acceptance testing, and even reviews and walkthroughs and things like that. The more filters you have, the more opportunities you're going to have to find defects. And even though it might look like a non-productive activity, the finding of defects is actually a very productive activity. And in fact, it gets even more productive when you start looking at what do we learn from those defects? How can we fold that information back into our processes and fix the things that are actually leading to the defects, the root causes? Now, there's something else I want to get into here real quickly, and that is maybe a way to measure this. And there's a thing known as the cost of quality. And let's slice it down a little bit further. And let's talk about the cost of software quality, because there's typically three components in the cost of quality. You have the cost of preventing defects, you have the cost of finding defects, which in our case is testing, and then you have the cost of failures and rework. But in software quality, there's a distinguishing between internal and external failures. So the idea here is that the internal failures are going to be less costly to find and fix than the external failures might be. But here's where kind of the magic happens. Let's say, for example, that we create some gaps in our cost of quality. So let's start out, and I'm sorry I don't have charts and graphs to go along with this, but hang with me here. Let's say that the cost of prevention for us is like 10% of our development budget. And let's say that the cost of finding is around 10%, the testing cost. We're spending 10%, which is actually a very low amount. Look, the cost of internal failures, let's say, is 10%. So now we're up to 30%. And then the cost of external failures might be as high as 30% of our development. So that would give us a total cost of quality, software quality, of 60%, which is actually pretty high. Most cost of qualities that I've seen have been somewhere between 30 and 50%. But just for the sake of illustration here, so let's say that we increase the cost of prevention up to 20%. Okay, now we're starting to close the process loopholes and things that are causing the defects. And let's say that we're spending more time on testing and more cost, therefore. So we're up to 20% there. So now we're at 40%. But that's going to have this really great effect in that, let's say that we reduce our internal failure cost to 5%. Now we're at 45%. And our external failure cost might be also like 5%. So now we're at a total of 50%. Now that's still high, but it's 10% less than what we were before. So if you apply that 10% savings to your annual development budget or to even individual development projects and things like that, you can consider that found money or additional value. And you can use that for all kinds of things. You can buy new tooling, you can do more process improvement and kind of keep that cycle going. It's certainly better than just spending time after time finding and fixing the same kind of defects. That's kind of really when it gets bad. When you just get this feeling that, man, we're just dealing with the same problems over and over again. It's just really, you get a sense that it's waste. And actually, that's what they call it in the manufacturing world when you experience rework. It's called waste. They literally have to throw that item away. In software, we don't quite feel it that way because we're dealing with digital stuff and intangible stuff. We don't really get a chance to throw stuff away, but typically we can discard it and start over again. That's a form of waste and stuff too. So all of that stuff that I was talking about just now is about defects, okay? And the defects that we find and prevent are one less that the customer is going to find and experience, which leads us to a great value of testing. It's making the product better, even though we go through the experience of creating a defect and then later finding it. Wouldn't it be better if we didn't create them in the first place? But so our job as testers, really the reason why we're hired, and I'm going to say 99% of the cases, is to find defects. That's what management pays us for. And you know that because when we miss a defect as a tester, the first question that comes up is, well, why didn't testing catch this? And we experience the negative side of it, right? So we know the expectation is out there. But I'm going to suggest that we want to be more than a bug finder. And you'll hear this all the time. You know, I'm not certainly the only one that has taught this or mentioned this. But here's the thing. When you're just seen as a defect finder or bug finder, eventually people start to associate you with the problems. And if they see you talking about a defect, or you report a defect in Jira or whatever, it's got your name on it, you're the owner of that defect, even though you didn't create it. You know, I've even heard it said in meetings before, well, if the testers would quit creating all these defects, we could get this thing out the door faster. Well, you know, of course, as testers, we didn't create the defects. We're just reporting on it. But there's a great opportunity in all of this that we can add even more value to testing. And one of the, or just not only to testing actually, but to development and to an entire project. But here's just a few things that I would suggest maybe that you can do to add value to your efforts. One is just to be helpful. Helpful as an information provider to developers and to others like project managers, release managers, Scrum Masters, and so forth, just to give them the information they need and to be helpful in trying to resolve problems and to know the status of the release or whatever it is you're working on. Another big value-added point is to assess risk. And that's not just from the defect perspective, but from many angles. Like, is the customer ready for this release? What are the environmental risks and things like that? And you can do that throughout the release cycle, and you can track risk and report on them. And chances are there may not be anyone else doing that in your organization. You can also assist in root cause analysis. This is that effort that I was just talking about, where you can kind of close the gaps and you can go in and you can actually go from that find and fix mode to prevent the original cause of the defect, so you don't even have to enter that debugging cycle. You can also help in gathering metrics. Things like, you know, what kind of defects are you experiencing? How are they being seen? How long does it take to get them fixed, and those kind of things. And you can also see it as some value points in learning about the thing that you're testing. Sometimes we really don't know much about the actual thing that we're testing because sometimes that documentation just doesn't exist. So the more that you can learn and share your learning with others, that's another great value point. And you might could think of others as well. Those are just some of the things that come to kind of the top of mind as I start thinking about this. Well, I hope this podcast kind of got you thinking about what it is we do as testers and how you can actually bring that value into your organization and make it known. Now, as far as making it known, you know, that happens in so many ways. It can be informal conversations. It can be testimonials from people. It can be how you communicate things to your management. It has to go up the line, though. At some point, the people in the corner office, so to speak, they have to know why the company is investing in testing. And hopefully that's how they see it, is an investment. I know that there are opportunities sometimes we get to make the message, and sometimes we kind of have to make the opportunities to make the message. Well, anyway, I hope you found this information that I'm sharing today helpful. If you have, once again, feel free to share this podcast with people that you know. If you want to get more of my podcast, then be sure and subscribe to that. And if you like this episode, give me a thumbs up. I would appreciate that. And if you have any comments, I promise I read the comments and I take them to heart. And if you have a question, pose it in the the comments and I'll either answer it there or I might answer it in a future podcast. So anyway, thanks a lot for watching this one, and I hope to see you next week in the next podcast. So thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you later.